Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. We're going to be improvising a little bit as we sort of figure out the actual physical structures of where we are all sitting and where we can be seen and heard both here and on the live stream. So forgive us if there's a little bit of shuffling as we work all these details out. Thank you so much for coming to this session. We are so delighted to be here. Well, I'll let everyone speak for themselves, but I know I'm delighted to be here. Really thrilled to be talking with you all about innovative models for the dissertation. My name is Katina Rogers. I work at the Graduate Center at City University of New York. I'm Deputy Director of the HASTAC at CUNY Hub and of the Futures Initiative. And particularly excited to be moderating this panel as it's an extension of something that we did at the Graduate Center last fall. So we're going to be talking about new models of the dissertation. We know that research and scholarly communication practices are changing. The challenges now are to develop some new systems that can support this innovative work that people are doing. That is incredibly rigorous, but sometimes difficult to categorize and evaluate. And I think those are some of the main challenges that we're seeing now. We're also here to provide some models for current graduate students and perhaps for faculty members who are either creating or perhaps evaluating projects that go beyond the traditional text-based narrative, text-based dissertation. So this morning's panel features a number of scholars who have successfully completed or are completing innovative dissertations with non-textual components. Joining me today are Gregory T. Donovan at Fordham University. If you could just give a wave when I say your name, that would be helpful. Thank you. Kathy Gossett at Iowa State. Justin Hodgson at Indiana University, Amanda Locastro at the Graduate Center at CUNY, Liza Potts at Michigan State, Nick Susanna at the University of Calgary in Alberta, and Kelly Westerling, who's also at the Graduate Center. We're also joined by Kathy Davidson, who will be a respondent after everyone says their introductory remarks. So as I mentioned, today's discussion is a follow-up and an expansion of a session that we held last fall, which was co-sponsored by HASTAC at Duke, HASTAC at CUNY, and the Futures Initiative. That panel, called What is a Dissertation? New Models, Methods, and Media, was held at CUNY Graduate Center, as well as over 20 satellite locations who participated virtually around the world. This morning's panel is going to begin where that one left off. We're going to jump right in and focus on a series of questions that were generated by the virtual and in-person audiences of that panel, so that we can get into some of the really deeper and, I think, maybe thornier and more provocative issues that all of these projects raise. So first, a few notes on the structure of today's session. You can see I'll leave this slide up during most of the discussion period so that you have everybody's Twitter handles. Please feel free to tweet using both the HASTAC 2015 hashtag and remix the dis. There are a couple of URLs that are up on the screen as well that will be useful for you. First, the bit.ly link, bit.ly/remixthedis-2 is a public Google document where you can see some of our own planning discussions, some of the questions that we're planning to go over today. And you'll be welcome to take notes there and add your own questions as well. I can't promise that we'll be able to address anything that's added to that document on the fly during the session. But if the last session is any indication, there will be some ongoing discussion after today's panel where we can tease out some of the additional questions that are raised today. So each panelist is going to give some very brief introductory remarks. You can see there are a lot of us who are here today, so we'll keep things rather quick at the beginning. Everyone will take just 3 minutes to describe their own work and their reflections on what they've been doing. Then we'll jump straight into the discussion. We'll start, as I mentioned, with the questions that were raised last fall, and we'll welcome your questions as well from the audience. In addition to the Google document that's up on the screen, you might also want to explore a collection that we've put up on HASTAC. It's at hastac.org/remixthedis. There are materials related to today's panel as well as last fall's session, and a number of other resources, reflections, and so on innovative dissertations. These documents also include links to all of the speakers' projects, so that if you do want to go more in-depth with anything that you're hearing about today, since we do have such a short time for everyone, that's the place where you can learn more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gregory Donovan to start us off. I'm just going to go through in alphabetical order rather than the order you all are sitting in. I think for the live stream, we should probably have people come up here.
Yeah, that would be easiest.
Yeah, we'll do that, and then we'll see how we'll manage the discussion after. Thanks, Gregory.
All right, so I will try to keep this very brief in order to make time for everyone. But a few things I want to point out is that the dissertation project that I completed in 2013 is archived more or less in its entirety at mydigitalfootprint.org. So anything that I would be talking about, from the actual dissertation to the research I did, the work I did with young people, would all be kind of archived here, including the defense of the dissertation itself. Not only did I try to include digital media in the dissertation, but after completing it, the dissertation defense was a public defense, and it was live streamed and it was archived on the website as part of the overall dissertation project, so I'd be happy to speak to that a little bit later. The project specifically, though, was what's called a participatory action design research project. So I was interested in how proprietary media operates in young people's everyday environments, and I was particularly interested in what happens to conceptions of privacy, property, and security when you take the classic young consumer of a social network and make them the producer of a social network. So I worked with 5 New York City youth pretty closely over a period of 6 months. We met for 4-hour workshops every other weekend to develop an open source social network and to acquire the knowledge that we would need in order to do this. And in that process of developing a social network from the back end, we began to sort of critically and reflexively interrogate the ways in which Facebook and other kinds of proprietary social networks build knowledge on young people. But in this case, they were in the kind of driver's seat of building knowledge on others, and thus being able to rethink what something like privacy means, whereas your average 15-year-old might think, as a consumer of Facebook, they can manage their information in a way that their parent or teacher won't see, and thus they feel like they have strong control over their privacy and aren't particularly concerned about things like surveillance. But once they were put in the kind of production seat, they realized how much data actually came across on the back end, how much you could actually learn and understand about an individual, and that there were more people to consider than just your mother or principal as to who could see something you were posting online. So this led to very kind of productive discussions with youth co-researchers that was only possible because we actually made the design of open source software part of our research methodology, part of the actions we were doing that took kind of traditional consumers and people that were researched through market research and making them producers and researchers themselves. And so in that way, the project tried to sort of remix both the epistemology and ontology of a traditional dissertation. I should also note that my discipline, we could call it that I graduated in was environmental psychology, which is in and of itself an interdisciplinary field. So I was sort of freed from the idea that my committee itself came from different disciplines, so no one person was really asserting this is how you do a traditional anthropology or psychology or sociology dissertation, and that also was a huge assist. I'll probably leave it at that, just throwing out a lot at you, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Kathy?
So I'm Kathy Gossett, and this is Liza Potts, and we kind of worked together on the project we're going to talk about. Neither one of us actually completed a digital dissertation, but one of the frustrations that I have...
Because you're old.
And because I wasn't able to complete one, that's what made me interested in this area of research. So in 2009, I actually did a pilot study in rhetoric and composition, technical and communication, and was looking at how many people could do dissertations, what were some of the problems with digital dissertations, and some of the things that we found were very surprising, actually. One of the biggest ones that we found was that everyone, like 90% of the people we surveyed, thought that we should be teaching digital methods and we should be able to be doing digital dissertations, but no one had any classes in it and no one thought that there should be time made in coursework for this. So how do you support this? The other big surprise that came out of it for us was actually that dissertations, the format of dissertations, was being determined in some cases at universities by ProQuest because of what kinds of documents they would take or would not take. And that ended up being the case at my institution, but I was very surprised to find out that that was even broader of an issue. So this kind of morphed into the second project in that I think we have a slide about it. Are we going to this slide?
Yeah,
oh,
sorry,
okay.
I think it didn't update, but keep talking and
Okay.
I'll
Called D3, so the Digital Dissertation Depository, which is actually creating an open source, open archive solution for a place for us to be able to archive and maintain these dissertations so that we have a place that's not dependent on ProQuest or any of those other for-profit companies to be able to actually archive and maintain these systems that we build as digital dissertations.
Well done, very fast.
Thank you. I'm getting there.
So what we ended up doing was we had a workshop that brought together various experts and people who were actually doing digital dissertations at the time and digital humanities librarians to talk about building this repository. Turns out building this repository kind of terrifying. It's a really big undertaking because part of what you want to do is to be able to archive a dissertation, how it looks and interacts now so that you could maybe look at it again 10 years from now. There's a lot of people at archive.org that are also doing something similar, and is it at Myth? They're also doing something else like this. So we're sort of walking, letting other people kind of handle that. What I'm more interested in right now as an information architect and someone that does user experience is creating some way for everyone to be able to find each other's digital dissertation. That's something I found is an issue for my own students. They want to do this. They know other people are doing it. They don't know how to do it. So they wanted to look up other people's dissertations. But these are all on disparate systems. They're housed at different libraries or on different websites. People kind of hear about them at conferences like this and share the information in hallways. But I would love for us to sort of build a place that could link all these dissertations, not to hold them, but to hold information so that everyone could find each other. Make it open, make everyone able to put their own entries into it, create their own metadata around it, and for us to be able to see this, because I think if we make this more visible and we can show committees that this stuff exists, and that here's the place where you can see all the links for all of them, that would also help a lot with the legitimacy of this. So that's what we're helping to do next, and the next phase of our work on this project.
Yeah, that was one of the things that came out of this workshop. This was an NEH-funded workshop, was that we realized that this was 2 stages. So we needed to have the first phase where we build this kind of interactive database that just lets us know that things exist. And then the bigger issue, because obviously, like Liza said, Internet Archive and other groups are dealing with this idea of archiving all these digital media. We just don't have a solution yet, so that's more of a longer term project. But one of the things that we did find with this D3 project is that there are other sources out there, other systems out there, but they're not all meeting the needs. And so that's why we really feel strongly that we still need to go ahead and build these things. Like there's the National Networked Library of DCs and databases or something like that, the ETD systems, but none of these are really networked and really aggregate the information we need as both scholars and students to find these examples of digital dissertations.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to put this up here.
Okay, great.
And when we move to the discussions for the stream, we just pass this around.
Thank you. Justin, you're up.
I'm going to set my timer down a little longer. It's okay.
I'm watching too.
You should. This is kind of having a leg if I get too much. I have remarks prepared, but I want to go a different direction.
So my name is Justin Hodson. I'm a faculty member at Indiana University, and in grad school a number of years ago, though it doesn't seem that long ago, I attempted, though unsuccessfully, right, to do 2 dissertations, one in print and one in digital format. And the reason why I was unsuccessful is not because the project wasn't valuable or accepted, but because I got a job, and so I did the print one and then took the job, right? But the point, right, when I started out to do these dueling sort of approaches was to demonstrate in as meaningful ways how we actually construct knowledge and make sort of knowledge available through the format called the dissertation. What is an argument? How does it get presented? You know, and in truth, right, a dissertation is a kind of experience. You're reading it and you're taking knowledge in a very particular way, and it's a tradition we know well. Particularly, it's often linked to this process of ekphrasis, right? And so when we move to the affordances of multi-mediated, multi-layered, interactive type artifacts, right, there's a shift that needs to happen, or at least I think there's a shift that should be happening given the affordances of these media, and that's a move away from ekphrasis as the dominant approach and thinking more about experience design, about constructing knowledge experiences for people, for users, right? And so part of this stems from this model we adhere to that separates form and matter. It comes back to Aristotle's sort of metaphysics, this hylomorphism that Gilbert Simondon has complicated in interesting ways. But we still use this terminology a lot, the separation of form and content, container contained, McLuhan's medium message. And the truth is these things are not that separable, right? Shoshana Berger gave a talk a couple weeks back at a networked humanities publishing event where she said you can't write a digital story without the code, right? It just can't happen. And I would say you also can't write a digital story without the aesthetics. And so one of the things that I think when we approach a conversation around digital dissertations is to think about the ways in which the sort of architecture and aesthetics of a particular representation create experiences for readers to learn and to take on or to engage with knowledge. And here it's not just a matter of proffering the similar kind of practices of critique, but to think about dissertations as creating creative problems, right, which in themselves comment on or challenge particular epistemologies or ideologies and things of that nature. So as we get into the questions, I'll try and sort of direct some of my answers in those ways to give you a better sense of what I'm talking about and how these things are kind of taking shape on my end. Is that good? Am I out of time?
That's great.
Good.
Thanks, Justin. Amanda?
Hello, so I'm Amanda Locastro, and I'm completing my dissertation at the CUNY Graduate Center in the English program. My dissertation is digital in its materials, its processes, and its product. And this may not constitute a non-traditional dissertation in some disciplines, but it certainly is still in the humanities. My dissertation investigates the use of public-facing blog sites, which are gleaned from an archive of over 3,000 WordPress sites created as part of the Macaulay ePortfolio system. I'm examining these course sites and student blogs through a triangulation method, using both surveys and interviews of the students, as well as a distant reading of the writing, the actual content of those sites. These methods allow me to explore the different ways that students generate content on the blogs and their understanding of these processes. I'm also able to compare content across the disciplines and across different levels of education through this study. The dissertation is certainly an experiment. I took on this challenge in order to learn these new methods. And I'm using the blog you see here behind you to kind of document my process as I go along. The idea here is that I would be able to share my learning process with my committee, but also, since we're at HASTAC, with birds of a feather, of other people who might be interested in learning these methods and experimenting with some of them themselves. And in a meta-level attention to medium, my final product will also be a WordPress site that contains the survey results, interview videos, and the data visualizations, which are interactive, alongside the text of my dissertation. And this will actually live in our CUNY institutional repository called Academic Works, which is one of those non-connected individual institution repositories. And it's also archived by the Internet Archive, which is a service we recently started at CUNY as well. So those are just a couple of the topics that I think are across almost all of our discussions that we can talk about in the Q&A.
Thanks, Amanda. Nick?
So I'm Nick Susannis. I think I'm an honorary digital humanities person. I did my doctoral dissertation in comic book form, and I finished last spring from Columbia University. And I'll say I didn't come into doing this as, I wasn't trying to challenge the system or something like that. I mostly thought, why not? Why not do it in comics form? Because I can do smart things in comics, and it didn't seem like that big a deal. Obviously, the more I got re-immersed in academia, I realized that that was maybe not a normal thing people do. And so the work itself became a way of challenging that, and became quite a bit about itself, pushing on why have these narrow boundaries been established? Why is 12-point type, double-spaced, and 1.5 by 1 by 1 by 1 margins the thing that we do? And I think for me, working in comics really let me see, quite literally, see things that we miss when we work in only one mode. And I think it was a way for me to come at things from many, many, many angles. And comics allow sort of linear sequential thought. They allow all over thought. They allow the visual and verbal to interact in ways. And I can move between modes of sort of more, argument, boom, 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 to information design. Comics sit between a lot of those things. So let me really look at everything from science to literature in a range of modes. And the other thing about it is so much, I've said this a lot in talks, is how much I think that my comics are smarter than I am. And I think it's so much because working visually and textual, image and text, and letting my visual system be a part of that interaction, it allowed me to see connections, to make connections that I really wouldn't. And I think, Justin, you spoke to us a little bit, like form and content being one, and I think very much about aesthetics. I was at a talk where somebody talked about the work as aesthetics equaling analysis. And I think in my case, trying to make the aesthetics work with the analysis often generated, and there's one of the links talks about this final little corner there, where the page itself, I had an idea for it, and I needed to reference something in science, and the aesthetics said you need to go do some research. So I did an enormous amount of research on something that had nothing to do with what I was doing, except it did. So I think in working this way, it really pushed me to discover things I wouldn't have, and it really made research a journey rather than sort of filling in pieces. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And Kelly?
Thank you. All right, so I'm the last one to speak, and I'm going to be super, super short because I am a PhD student in theater and performance studies at the Graduate Center at CUNY, also a fellow with the Futures Initiative, so I work with Katina and Kathy on a daily basis the past 2 weeks because we had just finished a huge event. And some of you may also know me as one of the 2 directors for HASTAC Scholars, and so I hope I saw some of you at the unconference yesterday. So I'm going to keep this super, super short because I'm at a super early stage in my dissertation work, and so I guess we span the whole range in the panel. My dissertation addresses the history and political aspects of the quite new artistic form or genre boylesque in New York City, which is a sort of spin-off or a subgenre of the neo-burlesque. Male striptease. So I'm contextualizing this history in New York and the US at large. And I'm currently working towards my dissertation proposal. And part of doing this was to start working with the proposal as a scalar site, where I'm also using other tools, as you can see behind me. I used CartoDB, or I'm currently using CartoDB, I should say, and Twitter scraping to map out the locations where people are tweeting about the genre itself, just in order for me to have this kind of exploratory phase where I look at the ways that the genre is traveling between different locations. And so I am interested sort of in understanding this in a very sort of particular, traditionally, I guess, research way, but I'm also interested in, like Nick said, he didn't want to challenge, or you didn't want to challenge, but you challenged the form of the dissertation itself and research. And I feel like my work, in my work I want to challenge, and I'm sort of pushing the field of theater and performance studies towards thinking about the connections between the discipline itself and this field of new media studies or social media studies, or what do you want to call it. I think I'll leave it at that, and then I'll hopefully be able to talk a little bit more about it when we get to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great. Kathy, do you want to come up and say a few words? Thank you all so much. That was terrific.
So I'll stick to my 3 minutes too. First, I just want to say congratulations to all of you. I think one of the most important aspects of doing a new kind of dissertation, remixing the dis, is either being creative or foolhardy or taking chances, and I actually don't know a better way of having a great career than being willing to start with taking chances. The more you censor yourself at the beginning, the more you let the world censor you later. I don't buy the argument that playing it safe is what gets you the job. I've never known anyone who got the job by following all the rules and playing it safe. So self-censoring also means you deprive yourself of creativity, and every person who was up here made the point that by exploring a new form, they came up with ideas. I love Nick's formulation that were smarter than they were. I think part of what that is when you're breaking through those kinds of things that Scott Weingart talked about so persuasively this morning, that whole history of knowledge organized in certain kinds of scripted ways. Once you're off script, you're in that world of improvisation where you don't know what's going to come out of your mind, your body, your eyes, your ears, your hands next, and what's going to turn into a dissertation. That's incredibly, or your code. I mean, it happens in science all the time. That's what invention and discovery are. It's one reason why there are all those stories in the history of science about I was stuck and then I was about to step on the streetcar and I noticed the relationship of my foot to the streetcar to the street, and suddenly I broke through a whole theorem for the first time, right? It's when you're breaking outside of the form that the excitement happens. And I believe that excitement doesn't just happen between you and the page or you and the digital archive, but happens in the way you translate yourself as a human being as to the world, whether that's to your students, to your peers, to your directors, or whatever. I think it's a performance and a practice. I actually think the best part of a dissertation is it's a performance and a practice. It's not just a product. And in fact, the more you see the dissertation as a product and an endpoint, the more you see yourself as a product and an endpoint. And there is nothing worse for the human spirit than to think of yourself as ended and complete and done and accomplished and a master, rather than always and forever on a journey of what is the new. So that's my overview, and now questions. That's just my summation from all of you for who I have insane amounts of admiration for all you do. And I know you will have a better life and make a better impact on all of the professions we represent by having taken the chances you have. So thank you very, very much for all you do.
Great, so I'm going to start us off with a couple of questions and then we can see where things go. So do raise your hand if you've got something that you'd like to ask about. And we will work all that into the discussion. What I'd like to ask first, which I think a lot of you are interested in speaking to, is in the idea of remixing the dissertation, do you see this as something that's about the process or the product or both? And if you could also maybe speak to how this changed your understanding of the analytical process, what it means to actually be conducting this research in a way that doesn't necessarily look like what the expected result is. How does that movement toward a different kinds of product change the way that you see the analysis itself? We have a wireless mic now, so I'm going to bring that over, and hopefully if you all can just pass that around. I think both mics will still work. We'll see how this goes. All right. I don't know what the range is either, so. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
This is just for.
Oh, it's just for the live stream?
It should be just for the live stream, yeah.
Okay.
So just speak loudly then. And if you would like to move up so that you can hear a little better,
We will shout.
please feel free to stand up and move closer to the mic.
All right, so hopefully you all can hear me, but I think all of us would agree that in many ways the process is actually the same, right? You're doing research, you're formulating a hypothesis, you're testing that hypothesis, you're gathering evidence, and then you're trying to articulate arguments about the evidence that you found, right? Those are all the same. The difference is, at least for me, because my data is digital and that's new, right? I had to reinvent or discover ways of dealing with that data that certainly weren't typical in an English department. And because of that, I was constantly learning new technical skills, but also learning how to teach myself those technical skills. And for me, that's like the essence of what a great dissertation should be, right? Is about teaching yourself new skills, learning how to analyze data and evidence, and learning how to articulate not just the results, but how the process led you to those results. I also think it's what's really important in pedagogy, right? We want to try to convey the entire process of how we got to the end result, not just the end result. But that being said, the end result is also different. It is also, a digital end result as well. So that has its own set of challenges that Liza and Kathy are going to talk more about, but also challenges in the way that we articulate the relevance of a website. So I created a website. How does that equal dissertation? And those conversations are just as important, right, as the product itself. How we can communicate the relevance of these products.
Yeah, you can go if you. Oh, okay. I was just going to add that. So for me, one of the fundamental things that happens, right, is attuning to the fact that the technology is a collaborator, right? That when the product, right, when you sit down to do a traditional dissertation, you know what its form is supposed to look like, the margins, right? You know how to read a text, right, and all those things, and you often know how to produce that, and we sort of ignore the fact that the technologies we use in that activity is also a collaborator. I mean, if you write a dissertation in Word versus, let's say, something like Scrivener, the output's going to be different, right? They're both processing, but it's going to be different. And so something about doing a multi-mediated digital sort of version of dissertation sort of foregrounds for me the relationship between the technology and the sort of human collaborative partner, right? And the example I'll give is I went to a workshop on Sophie, because that's the platform that I used, following in the footsteps of Virginia Kuhn, who did her dissertation on TK3. And I was at this workshop with her and Bob Stein, and Virginia said, you'd have to decide early whether it's a movie or a book. And I was so confused, because I didn't know what I was doing, right? And so I sat down and I learned all these cool things about this technology, and in that moment I was completely paralyzed. I didn't know where to go from there, right? I didn't know how to play this game yet. And so the process fundamentally altered what the output was going to be. There was no way to, in a traditional dissertation, there's no way to know what the end goal is going to be, but it becomes a much more radically invasive process when you're working with technologies that often produce their own output, right? You don't know what the algorithm is going to say or do. I don't know if any of you use the program Hipstamatic, if you know this camera app. Right, you take a picture, and then what you see isn't actually what you took, right? It's some sort of series of algorithms that produce an output, and there's something beautiful about that. And on a very simple level, that's what digital dissertation production is. You're taking a picture, and something else comes out, right? Something else that wants to be said, and then you figure out how to make sense of that. Nick, you had to, I think you can shout, and then Mike will get you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to forget the first thing I was going to say. But I think collaboration, I mean, I thought of the drawings as a self-collaborator for me. In that, I'd make drawings, and the drawing said, this is something you should think about in text, and the text said, this is something you should draw, and this is something you should research. So there's this, I really felt like I just sort of hung on to the reins, and the thing led me to places. And the other side of that is, this was not the question I get a lot, do the words or pictures come first? And I say yes, but it's not a thing where I wrote a lot of text, or there is a text document that then I drew pictures to. And if I had done that, it would have been a very different thing, because the text would have led my thinking one direction, and then I would have had pictures that accompany it, and that's not a terrible thing, it's just a different thing. But instead, those two worked hand in hand, and I think them working hand in hand, it forked in very different directions than it would have otherwise. And the last thing, I was able, and I had one miniature thing on my slide there of it, I was able to include the sketches in the back of the book version of this. And to me, I don't know, this doesn't speak as well to everything, but including the process, I mean, I think especially for art makers, people who are not art makers, it looks like magic. And I think when you can see the process of how we struggle through, how these shapes teach you things, I think that's really important to me to sort of see what goes on behind that, and I think that's something that's really prevalent in my teaching and how I get non-drawers to start thinking through visualizing. So.
Anyone else want to speak to that one? Yeah, I mean,
so, speaking to Nick's point, and also for Liza and Kathy, putting the process online can really help people start to take that first step. Is your repository, the repository you're building, is the code for that on GitHub? I mean, like, are you making that a public document?
Let me just repeat the question just for the purpose of the live stream. So the question is, as we're talking about working in public and so on, are people making the code for their own projects public? Are they putting it up on GitHub at some point?
The answer to that is we're still working on the depository, so no, it's not up on GitHub because we don't have anything yet. We're at that in-between funding point where we're applying for grants, trying to find money to be able to build this, but also partner with other groups like the Internet Archive and other groups that are thinking about this. But yeah, I know quite a few current digital dissertators they do have this online life and they do put all of their data out there for this express reason. The challenges, and that's why I think we came to the idea that we need something that kind of crawls the internet to find these things, is hooking them all together. I mean, we've got a list now through the Futures Initiative. Matt Kirschenbaum has a list. There's a list on digidis.org. So there's all these disparate lists, and so we just need, that's what we were thinking would help the field first, would be something that would crawl and find all of these things and make a compilation.
Right, and have a front face, have a website that would have listings of all the digital dissertations, and anything we build from that, as far as I'm concerned, it will be open.
Yeah,
completely.
that was a big discussion. Open source, open access. We want this to, again, if you can do better,
right,
go for it.
Right. We just want to get it started and united.
Yeah, I think this raises another important question, which is about the role of collaboration. I think in a lot of these projects, a works cited page might not look like what it would look like in a typical dissertation. So how do you give appropriate credit to all of the various projects that you're building on, the tools that you're using, the open source code that you're using for the website that you're developing? How do we acknowledge all of the players in these projects?
Well, and I know that was an issue for a colleague of mine who did complete a digital dissertation, and she was one, Justin, like you, she did two separate ones. But there was a question of originality in code. If we consider a dissertation, all of the words have to be original, then her committee also required all of her code to be original. So how do we build on other systems, and how do we use other systems? I mean, her argument was like, well, that would be like you telling me I have to write Microsoft Word in order to write my dissertation. But so there are kind of expectations that we have, at least in English departments, I know, of originality in how we address these things with these digital projects as well.
Their own language then? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to kind of, it sort of ties in this question, the last one about process, that there's always a lot of players, a lot of power going on in your dissertation process. And it's important to think about the way in which a lot of research technologies you use, and I think this is to Justin's point as well, that they're almost like becoming a co-PI on your dissertation. If you're investing in something as simple as SurveyMonkey to do all your surveys, you have to accept that that piece of software and that corporation is now intimately involved in your process, just like who you go out and find to be research subjects for interviews that you're doing are having some role in your process. And so interrogating the power relationships there, I think, are sort of important. So in my dissertation, where there weren't traditional interview subjects, there were co-researchers, meaning the young people went through the institutional review board and became research personnel to do the research and design work with me. And also we used WordPress and BuddyPress, which were existing structures, but they were open source, and then we modified and customized those and kind of tried to map out that process of both taking the traditional research subject, making them a co-researcher, and taking kind of a basic open source platform and then customizing it for the purposes of our research, and just trying to articulate that as part of a kind of clear methods chapter, where my methods chapter focused on some of these traditional ideas of explaining what kind of analysis and how I was gathering participants, but also trying to map out a lot of these power relationships going on in the process, both in terms of the technology and the participants, which is worth thinking about.
Well, I think it raises issues to proprietary software as well, right? Like, so one of the dissertations I oversaw or co-oversaw at Texas, the student used the iAuthor platform from Apple, which, does some really interesting things. Particularly, you embed an image, and you can make that image dance and sing in all kinds of cool ways. And his project was on community engagement, and he had the students, the community, the kids in the community involved to make their own videos, and that became part of his sort of ethnographic, pseudo-ethnographic approach. But the important sort of detail was that the dissertations are housed at Texas because they broke from ProQuest, right? And he had to get special permission to perpetually come back and update his dissertation for new Apple releases, right? Because they can't control and own the code, but they have to maintain it and make it available in perpetuity, so to speak. So now every so often he gets to come back in and make changes to his dissertation artifact, right? And what is the line draw? How do we view that? There's a lot of people very uncomfortable with that, and I told him he was a fool because now he's sort of wed to this thing forever, as opposed to like I washed my hands of mine and left, right? But it's when you think about making it available to GitHub and those kind of things, there are so many more user-friendly, like WYSIWYG kind of things that students can come to without having code skills, right? That they're going to want to use, and then you have to sort of adjudicate between, where do we sit on this matter? Can we accept proprietary software? I mean, PDF.
Katina, I think this is actually coming to one of our other questions. One of the other questions that was posed to us was, how do we take advantage of the way that non-traditional studies challenge notions of public versus private information in space? And for me, and I think definitely Greg as well, if not almost everyone up here, that was actually the start of our dissertation project. I wanted to see, corporations data mine our digital content for advertising and marketing purposes and for all other kind of subversive reasons. I wanted to see, could I data mine our students' content for pedagogical purposes, right? Could I do it for good instead of evil, right? What could I learn from our student writing that's in public spaces that would be helpful to us, that would teach us something about the way that they're learning and the way that they're producing online? I know Greg's project is very, very similar in that. And I find it very difficult to do this kind of work, this specifically public-facing work, without asking those questions as fundamental to your process. Like, why am I using an Apple product? Why am I using WordPress? Also, I did the same thing with my surveys. Like, I used a specific survey software that was safe, and the data is housed in a certain way. But also, your institutional review board will also ask you those questions if they're a good institutional review board, and that's difficult. It's to dig up the answers to how are you keeping this information safe, what information is public. In my case, I'm using student writing. That is vulnerable information, right? But it's all public. That's a very gray area, and those are very important ethical conversations to have about what does public mean in this new world of putting everything online. And some of the arbitrary things I had to do to my data in order to pass IRB are just as interesting. I had to strip usernames from my database, yet they all appear on the blog sites, right? So there's, we're in a kind of a brave new world of this kind of work, that these questions are not, there's no yes, no, right or wrong answer to some of these privacy and public questions. And the choice of software is right at the heart of that.
Yeah, there are some really interesting tensions between what is public but intended for a certain audience and then being used in perhaps a different way. I think there's also a tension between something that's very easily accessible now, it's open on the web, but perhaps uses a software that does become obsolete or difficult to maintain, or so on. Are there other questions about archiving and access and preservation that we should be thinking about? I know this came up a lot during our fall discussion. Yeah.
So a question about the archiving, especially digital dissertations, is, are you guys working with your libraries to make sure that we can find this material through our discovery services?
Sorry. I'll just repeat your question. Yeah, so are you working with your libraries? To expand on it, who are the allies in helping to ensure access and preservation for the future?
Well, I know for the the D3 project, one of the things that was very important to us was to have library and information science people on our group, in our discussion. So the universities that were involved here were Michigan State and Iowa State. And Michigan State actually has a great group of digital humanities librarians who build things.
Yeah, they're awesome.
So.
They, in their spare time, they build the most amazing, wild, crazy stuff. And they'll call me up and they're like, you have to come see this. It's crazy. It's awesome. I'm like, yeah, sure. I walked in. I was like, oh my God, this is the next stage of our project. Can you make it do this and that? Yeah, we probably can. I'm like, cool, stay here. I have to go write a grant. So yeah, and I think involving librarians, I mean, they're a treasure that we don't always remember is there, and that have probably solved a lot of these problems that we're almost reinventing for ourselves. So I would highly encourage you to seek out, if you, I mean, I'm sure you guys here have done this, to seek out your DH librarians especially. They're doing brilliant things, right?
Yeah, so at the CUNY Graduate Center, we just launched Academic Works. Our librarians really sought solutions to these challenges because there were students like us doing these projects. So when we came to our librarians and our advisors and we said, we have these interactive data visualizations and we don't know how to archive them, the librarians have worked with us over the past 5 years, speaking for myself, okay, so what do we do with this? We know how to archive static sites, but how do we archive interactive sites? And these are all challenges that your institutions don't know they have until you ask, right? You have to ask for help and you have to seek allies in order to get someone to be interested in the solutions. But I think one of the biggest overarching questions here that we haven't gotten to yet is the fact that we want this information to be open. Right? I specifically do not want my dissertation to be behind a paywall, and I want to maintain ownership rights over my dissertation. So that is also a challenge which needs a solution in higher education that you may have to find allies for. Greg.
Yeah. Just to kind of quickly build off of that, so in addition to our library at the CUNY Graduate Center has Academic Works that archives a dissertation, and it's good and it's getting better. Looking at how my website was archived by this in addition to the text, there's certain things that just don't really archive properly yet, but they do seem to be working on it. It's gotten much better over the past year. But I'd also note there's other ways in which scholars individually can take responsibility in archiving and making available their own work. So I'm not saying everyone has to do this specifically, but with my dissertation, the URL of the project is the title of the dissertation, right? So if you see my dissertation in any database, if it's ever behind a firewall, the title itself is mydigitalfootprint.org, and if you follow that, it's an archive and a public display of the entire dissertation that I control myself, in addition to it also being archived and backed up by the Graduate Center's library and internetarchive.org, I believe. And I think that's my final point with that. But that you can think of these ways of trying to get it out there. Oh, and also to Amanda's point, I used, which a number of people have done this, a Creative Commons copyright for the dissertation itself as well. So I didn't reserve all rights. I reserved some rights, basically giving away the right for anyone to share my dissertation. I still reserve all ownership, but anyone can share it without being penalized or repost it on their own server, their own archive, and that's explicitly outlined in an appendix to the dissertation to make sure that others can participate in archiving it as well, instead of just me in an institution.
Loving the panel. I think it's really interesting too because I mean this also is something that comes across generationally, and I'll just preface this by saying that when I did a digital dissertation in 2000, I had to pay this filing fee, but it was never filed. Like my dissertation was erased everywhere. And now from the other side of it, supervising a number of dissertations in this area, one of the things that I love about the D3 archiving project is that I think if you have these kinds of repositories, they're so important to be able to say there will be some kind of continuity. Because one of the things that I hear here around coming up with like 2 versions of the project, and that used to happen a lot, and you know the digital part would not be filed. Somebody would throw out the CD-ROM and would just file the 40 pages of print or whatever happened. But also that students have this huge responsibility. I mean, I feel strongly that students can't have this huge epistemological struggle and like be at this point in their careers and also have to deal with the issues of software management and who has the rights and how will it be preserved in perpetuity. I mean, there are large organizations taking this on in terms of making need emulators, maybe something else, but I think we have to work really hard to take this off the students' shoulders, which is not to say you can't individually have stuff on GitHub and work like that, but I also think it shouldn't be the primary thing that a student has to drag their institution. So I think more things like D3 is like just fantastic, and it also enables us, people who are supervising these dissertations, to say there are places that will archive this, so there will be a model where this will be available. The other thing I want to throw out is kind of unrelated, but I'm supervising a lot of students now when we talk about building code. For people who feel like, I think there's one path where it's like we all want this to be like open and shareable, and I'm dealing for the first time with a generation of students who have non-disclosure agreements, who are in embargo with their dissertations, and who have basically created code that might be commercialized. And I think this is something where, just as a tangent there, that this is also a thread of dissertations could be another issue that we need to deal with.
Having that discussion at the administrative level within a humanities department. You know, I'm overseeing a couple of digital dissertations, and we have kind of what we call a creative component, but no one has pushed it this far. And so these discussions about what this is and where it's archived and can it be embargoed, traditionally, I guess, English dissertations aren't. I mean, mine wasn't. But you know, Iowa State happens to be a scientific school, so there's lots of these models across campus. And so figuring out how we now pick this up and help our students. And that's, for me, that's the biggest thing. I wasn't able to complete one, and I want to be the mentor that helps students do that so you don't have to figure out those things. So it took me a year to figure out I couldn't write one by going to all the different offices, because I kept, you know, the administrative runaround. So-and-so has to approve it, and then so-and-so, and then I don't know, I think you have to talk to so-and-so. So yeah, absolutely. This isn't something the students should have to be dealing with in addition to doing the work and the research that they're there to do. I agree, absolutely.
Yeah, you have a question here?
Yeah. I'm Elizabeth Simpson from Illinois. Nick and Justin spoke to a degree about how the process fundamentally shapes the outcome. And of course that's true with text, we're just really used to it. Yeah. And as far as I try to figure out, since that's not my normal mode of doing things, I do a more recursive process of graphics and back and forth. So what are the roots? So there's this aesthetic roots and the life of the mind, which at the time also was limited by distribution. But now we're not so much limited by distribution, but we're still limited by the trends. And my understanding, if we have more diverse modes of thinking, not just modes of platforms, but modes of thinking, visual thinking, kinetic thinking, logical thinking, etc. If our purpose is to support better knowing, we're going to get better knowing at the end by involving multiple or different modalities in our process along the way. So it's not, I would say it's not the same. Of course it involves research and data, etc., but it's not the same in how we go about it. And I'm interested in what are some of the lines of arguments towards advocating positive outcomes. If we're here to develop knowledge, then this is a better way to develop knowledge because it's going to access more resources. So help me make the case.
You want to start or you want to? You can go ahead. That sounds good. Start with you.
Do you want to repeat the question maybe too?
Yeah, repeat that question.
So if I can sum up the question in a couple of words, I think it's fair to say that we're asking the panelists to make the case for why this is actually leading to different epistemological results, different types of responses to the questions that we're asking, not only because of those questions, but because of the process itself.
Yeah, well, I love your question, and I think we talk about it with you a lot. But the first thing that comes to mind, and actually the slide, the miniature slide in there, there's a citation from Susan Langer, the philosopher who's much under cited, talking about visual forms and other sort of non-textual being labeled irrational, not because they're not rational, but because the scaffolding of textual language doesn't fit them. And I think, I don't know that I can say more to that, except I think we clearly get at things. There are other ways of knowing. Anyone who's raised a child sees how they learn to walk by, reaching this foot out, and they start to lose their balance, and they start to find their balance. And I think so much of constructing knowledge should be that sort of pushing us off balance and gaining balance, and that takes place through our bodies and through our visual system, through all those other things. So I think that's very much an argument I make through my work, but unfortunately, I think it's an argument we've been making forever. Many of you probably saw the article on play in the last couple of weeks in the New York Times that said, once again, play is so important and we shouldn't be teaching them through, like, how many times do you have to hear that? And the same reason I said, why not do it in comics form? Like, you know, well, how many times do we have to make the argument that visual thinking, et cetera, is a good thing before we say, let's just do it. Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's do it and see what we learn. Anyway, that's less of an answer and more of a rant.
Well, I think, so for me, I would turn to game studies first and foremost, because what makes a game work and function and successful, right, is that it engages multisensory information on time, in place, and games do something better than most classrooms, and that's teach students how to play the game. Right? If a game doesn't teach you how to play well, then you know, it doesn't succeed. So at a fundamental level, game studies is a really ripe area for thinking about other modes of learning and engagement. But I would turn to things like Kress and Van Leeuwen, multimodal discourse, synesthesia as a sort of conceptual practice, even someone like Gregory Ulmer's work, sort of offering a different conceptual apparatus by how we think about what the digital is. His term is electracy, right, instead of literacy, because he wants to avoid wedding the digital to literate studies, particularly the ways in which we think about literacy formation. And he offers an entire array of different types of logics and engagements and terms. It's a bunch of neologisms, right? But he's funny, so it works out okay in some spots. But I mean, you know, and then there's cognitive psychology that can talk about the ways in which we learn from different kinds of engagements. Thomas Rickert's book on ambient rhetoric would point to things like larger systems of input that are part of knowledge construction and knowledge making. And at a theoretical level, it's a sort of shift from, you know, the sort of tradition of topoi, points of inserting arguments, to chora. And then there's a whole tradition of folks who pull from that and the way choreographical practices might work. And so that might give you a theoretical grounding for why it's important to engage in this multisensory, multimodal process. But ultimately, you're going to have to convince somebody at a very, very ground level that this object over here offers a similar, if not better, access to what we consider argument or knowledge or engagement that this thing does. And the sad part is they shouldn't be after the same kind of argument, right? But we have to make equivalencies, bridges, so that we can move on to other things. This is sort of what Scott McCloud does, right? And understanding comics is it's an enacting the paradigm. And in so doing, it reveals the sort of performative wonderfulness that is what visual media is doing. So I think to me, those are a lot of things to consider, but you have to approach it from all these fields. This is why interdisciplinarity is so both wonderful and helpful in this conversation, that it lays it out. It says, here's all these people doing all these things, and here's what they say, and I'm going to situate right here. Right?
Can I take that back for a second? Yeah. It's because you cited a lot of people that I also like, Kress and not Gardner and. Yeah. But all those people, we've been citing them forever, and they've been talking about this stuff forever. But they've been talking about it so that, you know, the theorists are there that are saying this stuff is good, but their enactment, I think is enactment. I don't know why we have to keep making it, but I think we just have to enact and not. You know, you can look at all the theories, and they're all there to back you up. Yeah. But anyway, sorry, I'm going to stop ranting.
Kathy's going to jump in last. There's also in the field of dance studies, I think it's a really important one to turn to as well. For the past, and like Kathy said, the dissertation is a performance. I mean, they have taken it literally, and lots of practice-based researchers are talking about sort of the creation of a different epistemology. Like, how do I describe a movement without doing the movement, and how do I understand the movement without actually having a body present, or some form of body present, or some form of movement present? And so there's a huge epistemological framework there to think about as well, and also returns us once again to the question of documentation and invisible labor, and how much of this do we have to put two frameworks of epistemology at the same time into what we're doing. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Just quickly address that problem of how if the theory gets said over and over and over again, and you still have to redo it again. I think that's true with any paradigm shift or epistemic breakthrough. That the naysayers and the people that are going to come up with all the reasons you can't are going to be there. And it's great that people have been saying it forever, because that means you can go back and say, wait, you said this, but here's this, and counter evidence. Dance is one of them. Dance has been doing digital dissertations probably longer for anyone because they have a field that doesn't make sense unless you can document in some way that isn't text. Somebody who was on the original Remix the Disc panel that we held at Duke, virtually at Duke and at the Graduate Center, Dwayne Dixon was doing an ethnography of skateboarders in Japan, and Duke wanted him to have was very nervous about some kind of documentation that wouldn't require someone. That's like the worst thing I've ever heard, that you have to go back to Texas every year and update your dissertation. That's horrible. I mean, I don't ever want to think about my dissertation again. I mean, never. I mean, that's really terrible. But what Dwayne came up with is he realized in the wet bench lab sciences, no one can replicate a wet bench experiment, so they have a lab write-up. So he went to the graduate school and said, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to do what the wet bench lab scientists do, and I'm going to have this whole digital dissertation and a write-up, a 60-page write-up that can be archived. And so it was archived using all of the, and then he's got a video and many other ways of archiving the other work. But there were precedents. So another way of saying there's a history and that we keep having to do it again is you say, oh, well, we've got precedents. You know, that gives us a kind of a ballast, so maybe we don't have to make the argument as much because there are such precedents. That said, it really annoys me that we keep having to redo the same arguments over and over again. I mean, this is nothing. I have the fortune of being at the place where I started my first tenure track job, and some of my students who I taught a bazillion years ago are here, and they said, gosh, you were grumpy about these things back then. I mean, it's not like your generation and your problems are the only problems. It is recurrent. If you're trying to get out of a framework, there are many Houdinis, and we need to embrace those Houdinis, but there's not going to ever be a time where we aren't going to need escape artists.
Well, and I think that this also follows through on the other side of this dissertation thing. You know, there aren't that many journals, there aren't many places for us, even post-dissertation, to publish multimedia scholarship. And we still have to make that argument on the other side of things that you're trying to make as a graduate student as well. I mean, I'm building tenure and making this argument that these digital things are scholarship, right? And I think that there are some things in my field, computers and writing, composition, rhetoric and composition, there's a long history of this kind of work all the way back to the 1980s that justify this multi-learning and all of those different types of projects. But I think it goes throughout this issue about kind of setting standards and changing things. It's moving beyond. I mean, I think it's being pushed now more because there are more people doing digital dissertations, so I think we'll start to really see change. But I think in my field, we have one journal, Kairos, that is fully multimedia. There's other online ones, but not multimedia, really. There's maybe one or two. So where do we go after these dissertations as scholars, right? And maybe we're going to have to start those journals.
There's more and more places you can do it. And again, like MLA, how long ago was it that MLA started doing it?
10 years.
So there's a 10-year archive for the Modern Language Association of how you credential digital work. So I think the most important thing is that there is that history, and people keep saying that over and over again, so you can quote it in citation. Citation still works, so you don't have to always reinvent
Be the original person.
That said, we need more.
I would like to make two, I would point out that this isn't exclusive to digital dissertation. Right? If you want to do any dissertation, you have to do the lit review, the groundwork that says, here's why the moves I'm making matter, here's where they fit, here's why they're justified. So the process is the same. It's just that you have to add an added layer of convincing somebody about the validity of this thing that's outside of a normal practice, right? And then in terms of where do we publish and how do we create these sort of things, one of the things that I did in my first year at Texas was I started an undergraduate journal for multimedia projects, right? So instead of thinking about the top level down, because really that's hard to get people, even post tenure, right? Unless you're full, it's hard to get people to take that risk with digital work because of the same sort of issues. So instead of starting at the top, start at the bottom, right? Let's build this ground up. And so we get every semester we publish at least one issue, minus this year some technical issues, but it's.
Just about.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Just about on the test. I want to take one more question and then we'll just wrap up.
Okay, so the question is for the ones who completed the digital dissertation and for the ones who are currently doing the digital dissertation. Can you talk a little bit more about who
So a great final question. Who is the audience that you're writing for in these cases? If we're having to make the case to our colleagues, are they still the intended audience? Is it someone else? Just quick words on that.
I think I have a really built-in audience for my dissertation because I'm looking at how we teach with blogs in higher education. Though, I mean, millions of people are asking their students to write in online spaces, and we have anecdotal evidence as to why that may be beneficial or have potential drawbacks, but we don't have kind of this huge study that looks at an archive. And because I have access to a decade of these sites, I really wanted to see if I could provide evidence for those claims we're making about asking our students to write in these online spaces. I also know that those people who are asking their students to produce public writing are also going to be looking in public spaces, right, for studies of this kind. So it doesn't make sense for me to put a study of this nature behind, right, in a traditional journal behind a paywall, because that's not where my audience would be looking for this kind of work. I also think that, you know, tangentially, I have an audience of people who are interested in WordPress and who are interested in interface studies, right? And again, that's all incorporated into the final results. Also, people who are interested in data visualizations, like the wonderful keynote we just talked about. I'm really thinking about how do data visualizations provide evidence or don't they? How do we interpret them? You know, are they useful? Could they be useful in this way? But furthermore, besides just the audience of, you know, academic peers and your committee and, you know, potential hiring committee and those people, I think you also want to talk back to your students, right, to the students themselves, to the students you teach and your peers, if you know, graduate students who are going to be going through this process, right? How did you create your dissertation? How do I create a dissertation? What does that look like? And I was hoping to answer that in the blog that I'm actually, you know, I blogged my way through my orals, through my comprehensive exams, and through the dissertation so that other students in the program could see what that looks like.
That's really, I think, a fabulous note to end on, that we're all in this together in some ways, and that the more we can create models for one another and chart the paths that we've taken, the easier that it will become, even if it does sometimes feel like we're saying the same thing over and over again. I think those, the tide will rise for everyone is the hope, right? So I want to end there. There are so many terrific panels going on next that I know you all want to get to, and so do we. And I think, as was the case in the fall, this has raised many, many more questions than even we began with. So I would encourage you all to tweet to the panelists, use the hashtag. We'll keep an eye on that. You're welcome to jump into the Google document and add some notes or questions there as well. And please do dig into everyone's projects because they're fabulous and we didn't have too much time to discuss them in detail. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you so much for this terrific discussion. And I look forward to talking with you all throughout the course of the next couple of days.